Hey, what's up everyone? Snoo here. Welcome back to another season of Path of Exile 1. 3.27 content reveal just came out. I got a chance to see it with you guys live after the fact. We had a lot of great information come out of that. A Juicers League by the looks of it, with a brand new Breach rework. And there was, unfortunately, a lot in the way of nerfs to some of our favorite super in-game juicing strategies. So we'll see what becomes of the league in due time. That is not the topic of discussion of this video. Suffice it to say, I have confidence everything will turn out well. Today I want to talk about builds, potential league starter ideas that I'm floating around. I haven't decided what I want to league start yet, and this is definitely not going to be a guide video. More of a concept video and something to help, get you guys' head wrapped around the new ascendancy rework of the assassin. Okay, so we had this screenshot come out actually the day prior, and it very much caught my attention with the potential of crit elemental poison archetype, which is an archetype we normally don't get the opportunity to play with. I figured it could offer a great deal of potential. I'm sure there are a lot of league start build ideas that are going to come out of this week with this ascendancy in mind. So keep your eyes on the lookout for that. I'm going to offer you one such potential concept league starter today. But I do want to emphasize the fact that this is not my league starter build of choice. This is not a finished guide by any stretch of the imagination. It's not even a guide. It's really a concept. But I did go ahead and flesh out a path of building, a snapshot of that skill and gear progression in time. So it's there for you. You can check the timestamps if you want to fast forward. But if you're not very familiar with the inner workings of this game and path of building and everything, I definitely suggest watching this all the way through from start to finish if you want to try to have a nice, well-rounded understanding about how this build archetype works, and you want to really walk away understanding, the build in question that we're looking at today. But yeah, most of it's centered around the assassin, what it has to offer, and some of the really keyed-in items that are going to be especially powerful. Very underrated items up to this point. So the line of text that grabbed my attention most of all here was infused toxin. All damage from hits can poison. That definitely perked up my eyebrows. I wanted to think a little bit about how I could potentially make a league starter around that, because the only time I've played around with this archetype is in late game with Original Sin in Sanctum League or Tincture in Affliction League. And we had the Tincture that made all damage poison, but those were kind of more in-game setups. But here we have it baked into an ascendancy, so this is a very unique opportunity to look at it from a league start potential. Now, the very fascinating thing about this is you can already make physical damage or chaos damage poison, and there are plenty of skill gems for spells or attacks that can do that already. But here's the thing, those gems are already quite often fairly obvious, such as Caustic Arrow of Poison or Poisonous Concoction. And those gems, they work for their purpose, and they're balanced around being able to poison. They quite often come baked in with this X amount of chance of poison, and their damage numbers are balanced with that in mind. What you don't see is elemental damage balanced with that in mind. And so there's an opportunity to look at the whole slew of additional skill gems, elemental skill gems that normally aren't eligible for poison, that together can offer way more damage than what you typically see just on your other normal gems that you're looking at, physical or chaos. Okay, the super obvious choice coming straight from my head is Elemental Hit of the Spectrum. Well, let's look at this. I mean, this gives just an enormous amount of flat elemental damage, but it has a line of text that completely bricks this concept. It says deals no non-elemental damage, and so the first thing you should learn, if you didn't already know, is that poison is always chaos damage. It's not even physical damage, it's chaos damage. Even if it's derived from elemental damage, it still ends up being poison damage. So Elemental Hit of the Spectrum is disqualified as a potential skill gem to use. However, there are other choices here, such as Explosive Concoction or Explosive Concoction of Destruction. Perhaps the strongest skill gem in the game as far as just straight up flat damage numbers that are offered. Conditional, but in terms of the collective total damage that is wrapped into a skill gem, I'm not aware of a gem that has more damage baked into it than this one, elemental damage. So just think about all of that added elemental damage wrapped up into one skill gem and how much poison damage you might be able to push out of it. One point of a confusion from earlier in the stream was the status of Explosive Concoction. The gem was actually changed coming into 3.27. Now, these changes are preliminary. We don't know if it's going to end up like this, but it was in fact massively buffed. with conditionals in mind. Some people thought it was nerfed because they're looking at it exclusively as a leveling gem, as like an SSF leveling experience. I'm looking at it right now as more of a league start early endgame setup that would no doubt utilize the power that it has to offer through the conditional Sapphire, Topaz, and Ruby flasks. If you go in here and you examine the difference in numbers, you're going to see a significant buff to everything, especially on Explosive Concoction of Destruction, everything between the critical strike multiplier number to the cold and lightning damage number. The only thing that gets nerfed is the fire damage number, which is automatic without the flash charges. Everything that has anything to do with the conditionals was buffed, and the buffs massively overcompensate for the nerfs with that in mind. So basically, I had the ascendancy point, the mandatory build enabling ascendancy point, and I had the skill gem in mind that I was thinking about doing. Not the only option, obviously, but poison explosive concoction assassin sounds pretty groovy to me. So let's move a little forward to see what other ascendancy options are available that would synergize with that. Now, as an honorable mention, there are many things that I'm not really going to talk about that I didn't really catch my eye, like Shadow Blood, Mistwalker to a certain extent, Death Marked, Unstable Infusion, Mystical Infusion, very good for cast on crit spell version, but Opportunistic Knife in the back for the jugular, and Toxic Delivery, basically the top to left side, is what really grabbed my attention as possible synergies with a build. First off, Toxic Delivery is on the way to infuse toxins, so you would have to pick that no matter what. And guys, these numbers up here is pretty crazy. When it's all said and done, the path of building I'm going to show you today, this one ascendancy point, Toxic Delivery, gives 77% more damage. Maybe that's not exactly right now, but at least at one point when I checked it, when fleshing out the path of building, 77% more damage from all that skill, poison effect duration, and 20% more damage from crits. That's not to even mention the huge amount of recovery that would come with it as well. Now here's kind of an interesting thing you first see. It said poison you inflict with critical strikes deal 20% more damage. Now this is a conditional that is often, makes it harder to manage, because usually if you look at the full history of poison builds, viable poison build, they usually don't surround themselves around crit, because it's not the most obvious thing that you would include in there. There's in the past there have been some synergies around crit poison, but it's taken a while for us to reach a point where crit poison actually seems to make a lot of sense and even be the superior way to approach it rather than just, pure poison damage. If we look over here from Knife in the Back and For the Jugular, they're kind of, inverse of each other. More crit chance, 100% more crit chance, that's double crit chance, and 100% crit multi. And then Opportunistic is just another ascendancy point that is kind of the least important one of the bunch, but basically the three big ones are Infused Toxins, Toxic Delivery, and in the case of what we're going to look at in this POB, For the Jugular, crit multi. That would snapshot in, and I don't actually need the crit chance. So here it is all zoomed out. This is a Poison Explosive Concoction Assassin crit build. And you can see it stretches all the way from Whispers of Doom all the way down to Dazzling Strikes. It's pretty high up and down there, but it just kind of stretches straight out from the Assassin tree, going a fairly obvious route, and then extending along the right-hand side. Looks like you can see as a general, just bird's eye view, it's focusing on crit, it's focusing on flask tech, it's focusing on some aura reservation there, and there's nothing in the way of poison. You don't see a single point devoted to poison, and that is where our first build enabling item comes into play. Introducing Cosprey's Will. This is a body armor that I suspect many of you probably haven't even seen before, let alone, actually used in a build of your own. It's that kind of in-between item that just always seems to get overlooked. I have had this body armor on my radar for various different builds I've made, Toxic Rain builds, Poison Concoction builds. It's never the one I choose. I always end up choosing, the Covenant or Dendrobate or Darosso's Defiance or, some other type of body armor that's maybe as good in certain situations. But today, for the build in question, and for really just about any poison-based elemental build using the Assassin, this body armor is going to be extremely build enabling. It's got several powerful lines to it. It goes up to almost 3,000 evasion potentially. it essentially has a double roll of chaos res. You can apply additional curse. I mean, most of you know how strong that is potentially. Your hexes can affect hexproof enemies. That is a unique modifier, very unique modifier. It nullifies a map mod that can roll on your maps. But it's the bottom line that is really important. Oh yeah, okay. All right, honorable mention for all us blasters out there. 3% increased movement speed, can't forget that. Always poison on hit against cursed enemies. Now that is very specific wording. Notice over here, infused toxin says all damage from hits can poison. Not all damage from hits do poison, like I believe the Affliction League tincture did. All damage from hits can poison. That's very different, and unfortunately it means you're still left with a 0% chance to poison. I think in the intro I mentioned this skill gem, for example. You know, most gems that you would typically use for poison start off with a huge chance of poison roll on there. And so you're already kind of halfway there almost to getting the necessary chance to poison on hit. The rest of it you can find all over the place, in places like Fatal Toxin Wheel or the Swift Venomed Wheel with a chance to poison on hits with attack, or, you know, this one, Toxic Strike Wheel. Okay, there's a lot of opportunity to get poison on hit, and so you would think it's pretty convenient based on the traveling here on the tree, but, you know, we all only have so many points to spare, and you want to get maximal value out of each individual passive point you take, and there's a special reason why I don't want to invest in poison chance here, which you'll understand in just a moment. So the line text here, always poison on hit against cursed enemies, means I need 0% chance to poison on hit. That saves so much in terms of investment that I need to give. I don't have to run Herald of Agony. I don't have to use build enabling armor pieces that have poison chance baked into them. I don't need to spend any points on the passive tree. And here's another big point of the video here. Perfect Agony. It's a keystone that was buffed recently that synergizes tremendously well with crit poisons. Another huge enabler that is well timed with the Assassin rework. The Assassin rework, which is steering us towards crit poison, is going to sync up super well with Perfect Agony. And even better in the event that we don't need to invest into poison on hit chance. I mean, just take Toxic Strike. Toxic Strike Wheel is a perfect example of this. It comes with a hefty, you know, on the back end, the last notable point, 15% chance to poison on hit. And 15% damage over time multiplier for poison. Watch what happens when I take all this damage over time multiplier. I get 0 damage for it. Why is that? Well, that's because of Perfect Agony. Perfect Agony makes it so dot multi as a stat does nothing for you. Now, you could look at that as a downside. It's like, oh, well, now I get no value out of it, so it's not as good. Or you could look at it as an upside and say, oh, now I don't even need to worry about that stat. I can prioritize other stats and get more value that way. And so one of the big takeaways of the video is that if you're running infused toxins, unless you're using a skill gem which happens to have a lot of baked in chance to poison on hit, which you're probably not going to be because you're probably going to be using an elemental damage gem, you really want to figure out a way to not have to scale from 0, all the way from 0 to 100% chance to poison on hit the hard way. Now, there's more than just one way to do that, but this body armor is a fantastic way to go about it. Here's another great item. This one's a little bit more well-known, and I've seen this one used a lot here, especially for this top line. Up to 350% pre-catalysted. Increased global critical strike chance for Ungol's Harmony. Especially good for cast on crit builds that would need to crit with both the attack and the spell, because it's global crit strike. It comes with a very awful downside of your critical strikes do not deal extra damage, and a few other stats. Actually, kind of good stats here if you're running a life-based block shield build. Well, your critical strikes do not deal extra damage would be an absolute murder for my Elemental Hill Spectrum build, but for this build that is already taking Perfect Agony, which also comes with the line, critical strikes do not deal extra damage, is essentially no downside. Because if I'm making the build around this keystone, this is where I'm baking in the calculation of the downside right here. If I so happen to have another item that has the same exact downside, well, it's not duplicating the effect of the downside, it's nullifying the effect of the downside, if you know what I mean. And so you can see what happens if I remove this amulet, my crit chance goes from 100 to 66. So I'm over crit cap because of this, and it just absolutely murders the damage of the build. And so this is also another build enabling amulet. It's not the only option, but it's definitely a really good one. Now let's actually go back to a second to the assassin. We'll notice knife in the back, 100% more critical strike chance against enemies that are not on low life. This actually enables you to not even need that amulet, because you could just use, say, you might even be able to use the inverse one that gives you a whole bunch of crit multi but less crit chance. That's a little tougher to work around, but that could be a viable way to go about it. And so, you're typically loading all your poison damage into the enemy initially, like before they're on low life, so you would have them poisoning down to nothing by the time they are, they're basically on their way to their deathbed by the time they enter low life anyway. And so if at that point they can no longer hit or crit to do extra poison damage, it's probably going to be okay. Now I decided to go about it in a different way, and I went for the jugular. Because I'm going to use that amulet, I don't need the extra crit from knife in the back. Instead, I can utilize the extra crit multi, which I believe in this case snapshots from enemies that are hit in the full life or half life status anytime prior to low life. So the poisons that are loaded into them will be actually doing a lot more damage, and will also continue to tick down for harder even when they enter low life. The reason why all that crit multi is important is because of Perfect Agony. So Perfect Agony reads off of crit multi instead of dot multi. So I no longer want dot multi. That's why I don't want to use all of my passive points for things like Fatal Toxin, Swift Venoms, and Toxic Strikes. I need to use them in things like Heartseeker or Lethality. We need to get all that crit multi that I can, or possibly even Assassination. So getting a massive amount of crit multi through the ascendancy is really strong, and appears to be somewhere in the neighborhood of around 25, maybe 30% more damage. Also pretty respectable for an ascendancy point. And then it also comes with critical strikes have Culling Strike. And then I suppose as the backup, I would be essentially guaranteed to crit. If for some weird reason monsters are crit resistant, or I can't crit them when they enter low life, it would certainly happen in that case. And then again, the last ascendancy point, opportunistic, where damage from your critical strikes cannot be reflected. The build that I'm showing you has shield charge. It doesn't have 100% crit strike chance, so it looks like it would still have issues with physical reflect, but I think elemental reflect is completely protected, at least from what I can tell. And so that might actually read in as a nullifier to one of the nastiest map modifiers we often deal with. And then it also has 25% more damage if it's single target on a boss, and then it has a fairly high uptime for 35% less damage if you were doing some really high-end juice content. A quick overlook at some of the other support gems. So one reason why I was interested in that body armor was to give the extra curse count. Now you can use Anathema as a ring to match it up with the power charge curse count, which, you can use 1 point here and get a curse count of 4. But I think Doedres is going to make more sense. You get more value out of this ring, and it's cheaper anyway with the all-res roll. So Despair, Punishment, and Temp Chains are all set up as auras, actually. And there's another helmet that you can use, Heretic's Veil, which ironically has like the exact same reservation almost, which is kind of weird. So a rare crafted helmet's a little better if you're getting some reservation efficiency, but that other helmet can work. And so with a full-blown aura setup, the nice thing is, when you're using this body armor, you see one of the conditions that says the enemy has to be cursed in advance. So you don't want to just rely on hit mechanisms for cursing, because that means your first hit's not going to poison the enemy. Or at least preferably, you would want some way to curse the enemy before you ever hit it, and this is the way to do it. You wouldn't necessarily need 3 curses. In fact, if I were to league start this, I would leave punishment out. It would help with the reservation, the gem spacing and everything, and then eventually get punishment or enfeeble into the build later after the fact. But Temp Chains and Despair in full form with Blasphemy with 25% less curse effect, with these not being default 0 quality, half value curses, almost maximum value curses, these do a ton of damage. Look at how much damage. Basically, if I turn both of those curses off, I'm doing half damage. And Punishment doesn't even count because the enemy's not registered at low life. And the cool thing is, because Punishment is a debuff on the enemy, it's proactively going, or rather dynamically going to affect the enemy when they enter low life. Remember how I said I was using that ascendancy point, which gave me crit multi when they're not on low life, snapshots it in, and then dynamically makes them take even more damage when they enter low life because it's a debuff on the enemy. Here's all the items. Okay, we basically talked about all of them, did calculations, looked at a lot of config stuff. There's more that I didn't talk about. There's one other thing that I will warn you about with this version of the build. A lot of times when you make poison builds, you kind of need to look at the duration of the poison because it can be a little misleading on how much damage it's really doing. So if we look at the duration, poison duration, if I can find it here. Yeah, 7 seconds. Now 7 seconds isn't awful, but that is a lot of duration. So you can think to yourself in real time that is a bit of ramp up that would need to kick in first before you would really see this full damage number. So that's there. You know, there are ways to maybe make it faster, change out one of the supports just to deal damage faster. I don't know, like sadism or whatever support it is. So that's an option there too. Not anywhere near poison cap, but this snapshot in gear and progression is quite early. Certainly viable for day one for many players, myself included, could probably fit this out in as early as day one. So I would say it's a pretty nice overall concept build at the very least for the assassin. Again, crit elemental poison-based archetype build. A new archetype for many of you. I know many of you have never even played anything like that. I have some experience playing it. It's a lot of fun. Never league started it before. And I got to say, for myself, it is at the top of the list as far as potential league start archetypes. I don't think I'm necessarily going to use Explosive Concoction. Probably going to do something with Cast on Crit with Mystical Infusion down here. So stay tuned for a future video. Might look into that possibility. And if you were on stream earlier today, you kind of know where my head's at on that. Well, guys, that's it for this video. Hope you enjoyed this little, mini showcase. I didn't have any footage to show you outside of what I did previously because I don't have the build set up, and I'm not planning to set up or test this variation of the build unless for some reason I do decide to league start it. But just giving you some value for the time that I did put in, or was able to put in, at least a minimal amount of time setting up path building, and help you guys think and wrap your head around the assassin ascendancy and the possibilities around that. And so there's many more things to talk about as far as the content reveal that I'm not going to get into in this video. I may or may not make a video around. I want to spend the bulk of this week testing and getting a solid understanding about what league starter I want to do. For those of you who are interested in Elemental Hit of the Spectrum, I can promise you that build's going to slap really hard. Basically the same as it did the last league or the league before. And there are a lot of builds that apparently got all but deleted. Other league starters in the patch notes here. Elemental Hit of the Spectrum came out scotch-free other than a kind of global nerf to spell spreads. In fact, Warden got buffed with Barkskin notes. Not that I would take those probably, but they, Barkskin and its subsequent ascendancy point, which actually helps avert some of the suppress nerfs, that did get buffed pretty hard. So you might actually think about going one of those notables or both of those notables that got buffed from the Warden and check them out in the patch notes if you want. I'm not going to go over them right now. That's it for this video. I hope you learned something here today. I hope you're excited about Path of Exile 1 3.27. I'm certainly getting that hype. That the hype meter is rising ever so slightly. I really enjoy this time. I spent a lot of time alone just in Path of Building, looking at things and testing things and making the build, and then producing video for you guys. Ultimately, a League Start build guide, which is not here yet, but I promise you something will arrive before the League starts, so stay tuned for that at the very least. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments section down below. Thank you for watching the video, and we'll see you next time.